So you're aware that your primary job as a coroner under this particular legal statute of the law is um, when a county coroner is informed that
Objection, Your Honor. This is calling for a legal conclusion.
it's not, Judge.
Overruled.
When a county coroner is informed that a person has died, the county coroner shall investigate the death. You read that first line, right? And you're aware of that, right?
Yes.
You are under a legal obligation under the law as part of your position to investigate any death, correct?
Yes.
And if that death was suspicious or unknown circumstances, that's sub B, or the death occurred as a result of violence, whether by homicide, suicide, accident, you are required to investigate, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then as a result, if you determine that there's an issue, you can require an inquest to be conducted, which is basically like a jury trial, right? You understand that?
Yes.
Okay. And you are also to notify the police if you have any, before even doing an inquest, if you have any concerns under the statute that there's anything suspicious or out of the ordinary, you are to notify the police department and ask them to conduct an investigation. You understand that as well?
Yes, and we did have an officer on scene that helped investigate this. And we have an officer respond to every death call that helps investigate.
And I appreciate that, ma'am. But in talking to the prosecutor, you talked about, well, the Lividity caused me some concern. Remember you said that about Lividity, that was a concern of yours and your questions weren't answered, right? Well, at the time of the scene there, you said, you noticed Lividity in the body, that Tammy Daybell apparently had died on her back, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Was that of a concern of yours at the time that would cause you to say, maybe I ought to take a step back before I sign this death certificate?
At that time, no.
Okay, but you were fully aware of the Lividity that you're claiming had occurred at that point. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. There were no fresh bruises on Tammy Daybell's body anywhere, were there?
On her arm, yes.
Those were fresh bruises?
I don't know. I'm not qualified to
Well, you did
take that.
you did a report in that regard, did you not?
I did, and it looked like an old bruise to me. And with,
That's, we'll get to that.
okay.
So when you filled out your medical report, you specifically not only identified that she had bruises on her arm, you actually used the word old bruises. Do you remember that?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And these were not fresh or red or irritated or anything like that, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already indicated she's not qualified to determine that.
Well, based on our observations all over,
These weren't fresh bruises, were they, on her arms? These were old bruises, just like what your report says, correct?
I can't answer that.
Okay. But you will answer that on your report, when you decided to fill out a report relating to this case, that report said old bruises. When the picture of the body, you wrote on the arms, old bruises on the arms, right?
Yes.
No other bruises on her body anywhere else, right?
No.
Nothing else that would deem to be suspicious on her body, correct?
No.
And in fact, there was no indication of any trauma to the neck that you could observe, right?
No.
There were no scratch marks on her hands that would indicate any kind of a struggle, correct?
No.
There was no irritation on her ears or her face or her head that would give you any indication that there was any kind of a struggle. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. When you arrived, Chad Daybell was distraught, wasn't he?
Yes.
Sobbing.
Yes.
And you noted that it was his son that was not upset. His son was, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say his son was reserved?
Yes.
Quiet.
Yes.
And in the FBI report, you mentioned that you think that maybe his son was in shock, Remember that?
Yes,
Okay, and it's still your assessment at this point that at the time you felt that his son Garth was in shock. Is that right?
yes,
Okay. You went over to the nightstand, and on Tammy's side of the bed, you found the essential oils, right?
the book,
The what?
the book
The book.
of essential oils of natural.
Did you see any, I would represent you that Officer Greenell testified that she found a number of items in the bedroom. And you also saw cough medicine on Tammy's side. Is that right?
I don't recall the cough medicine being in the bedroom.
Okay, what about the medication for strike? What about the medication for bruises that she had, that was in the bedroom as well? Do you recall that?
No,
Okay, but if Officer Greenell was there, right?
yes, she
And
was.
detailed that in her report, correct? Correct?
I don't recall.
So back to I think where we left off is that Garth was, in your opinion, was in shock at the death of his mother, correct?
Correct.
And Chad Daybell throughout this episode of being there with Tammy, for the most part, was sobbing and was highly emotional almost the entire time. Is that fair?
Yes,
There was no instance where you saw that he was faking it or trying to pretend to be upset. This was a genuine situation where you truly believed he was upset about the death of his wife. Is that right?
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
Overruled.
You can answer.
yes,
Now, I appreciate you talking about it, and you mentioned it in the report that at no time did the family ever try to prevent you from doing an autopsy in this case. Is that right?
Emma stated she didn't want one done, but
Okay.
it's my choice, ultimately my
Right.
choice. Yes,
Emma didn't want one done because she didn't want her mother cut up, right?
correct. Yes,
She didn't want her mother subjected to she didn't want her mother treated that way as part of the examination. Is that what her primary and only concern was?
yes,
Okay. And yet Chad was indifferent one way or the other. He didn't tell you one way or the other whether he wanted one or didn't want one. Isn't that true?
yes,
And ultimately, it's not the family's decision whether this occurs. It's your decision whether this occurs. Is that right?
yes,
And based on the facts as you saw them, you saw some old bruises that you identified in your report, right? Correct?
bruises.
There were no other indications of a struggle or a fight as it related to Tammy Daybell's body. Is that right?
No, not that I noticed. No,
Okay. No other indication right up to the time you dropped her off at the morgue that there was any problem with Tammy's body in any way, correct?
explain problem.
Well, you didn't see anything as part of when you arrived to the time that you loaded her up and took her off to the morgue, there was never anything during that process that would indicate there was anything wrong with Tammy Daybell's body, right?
I don't know what you're asking me.
Okay.
I can't answer that question.
Okay, how about this? There's nothing suspicious that you noted other than the lividity and the old bruises that you put in your medical report, correct?
Correct.
On your left, when you're looking at the screen, and it's the face down figure, up on the arm, we have a term. What is that term?
Lividity.
And blood had gathered there. Is that right? That's what that means?
Yes.
Okay, and then a little further to the right on the same figure, there's another word what is that word?
Lividity.
And then to the left again on the same figure down near the lower part of the back, there's another word.
Lividity.
And then down on the legs, there's another term. What's that term?
Lividity.
So from what I gather from this, there was lividity on her entire body. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Okay. So we weren't able with lividity, you aren't able to really make a determination other than the fact that she was laying flat at some point, right?
Yes.
Or she was laying on her front, one way or the other, right?
On her back.
Okay. So in your report, when you discussed this with the FBI, you had based on all of your experience, you had said that the body had been dead for about 5 to 6 hours. Do you recall telling the FBI that?
Approximately, yes.
Okay, well, you said 5 to 6 hours, so that's what you testified to the FBI. Is that incorrect?
No.
Okay. So I guess the question is that Mr. Daybell mentioned that he was awoken by the fact that Tammy had slipped out of the bed when he pulled the covers. You recall that?
Yes.
And Tammy had fallen down and her head was on the floor and her leg was up on the bed. You recall that?
That's what I was told, yes.
Okay. So if Tammy had died in the bed and had passed away in the bed, this lividity would be consistent with her dying in bed on her back, right?
Yes.
And if she fell down and that's what woke Mr. Daybell up, there wouldn't be lividity up in her head, would there?
No.
So when Mr. Daybell told you that he was awoken when he pulled the covers, rolled over, and Tammy slid off the bed, well, that's consistent with the lividity here. She was in bed. She died in bed. And when he pulled the covers, she slid off. So wouldn't his story be consistent with the lividity findings that she actually was in bed for 5 or 6 hours?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to go over to the other side and the one that's facing. And on that particular one, it says something about tinged foam. Could you read that for me?
Blood tinged foam.
Okay, and that's what you observed on her body and we saw the pictures of the blood tinged foam in her mouth, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then further down on what would be her right arm, you put two words there. And what are those words?
Old bruising. Old bruising.
Okay, so old bruising. Now, you didn't put new bruising, did you?
No.
You didn't put any marks on anywhere else on her body, right?
No.
And as part of your investigation, you by statute are required to do a thorough investigation of the body. Is that right?
Yes.
And you did that day, didn't you?
Yes.
And what you came up with is that she had some foam in her mouth and there were some old bruises on her right arm. That's what you came up with, right?
Yes.
And you came up with nothing else on her body that showed any indication of any other trauma, marks,